So hello everyone and welcome back to another Phillips Go Green video interview. COP26 is fast approaching for Glasgow and the world, and it's an absolute pleasure to be joined by two incredible, inspirational people who are taking the time out of their very busy schedules to share their expertise in sustainability and positive social change. So Bruce Newlands is an architect from Inverclyde with over 20 years experience, and he's a founding trustee and chairperson of the Inverclyde Shed, a community space that encourages people to come together, sharing tools, talent and resources. Not too dissimilar to a library in that regard. Bruce also serves as trustee to the Glasgow Tools Library and the George Wiley Foundation. And he was a co-founder of Macnaughton, Scotland's first open access digital manufacturing centre, plus digital artists for the 2020 Galoscians Festival. He's also technical director of the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, a part of which he helped set up the Innovation Factory, a 35,000 square foot prototyping centre for the construction industry. And Bruce, I also very much enjoyed the librarian in me, like learning a new word on your LinkedIn, thalassophile, which means a lover of the sea. I didn't know I was one until I read it there, so thank you. And we're also delighted to be joined by Heather Macnaughton, who's a partnership manager at Historic Environment Scotland. And they happen to be one of the generous sponsors and exhibitors of the upcoming Phillips Autumn Regathering in Dundee. So Heather has extensive experience across a range of sectors, including housing, heritage, children's services, and economic development. And that's all within the charitable, public and private sectors. And she's driven by her desire to influence and deliver social change to improve people's lives. Both Bruce and Heather are also esteemed members of the Saltire Society's Housing Awards panel, and we're honoured that they found the time to share their expertise with us at Phillips Go Green. So thank you so much, Bruce and Heather, for being with us today. I wonder if I could start by asking you what you think are the key foundations for sustainability.
Heather, do you want to kick off, or do you want me to go?
You go first, I think.
Okay.
From a technical perspective, and I'll kick in.
I was just going to say, I mean, my role in practice, one of the things I do is very much from the kind of technical perspective. So particularly in measuring around carbon and energy. And there's for me, there's two key aspects, and this relates to all buildings. So there's operational energy and carbon. So what we use while we're using the building. And then there's also, and this is interesting in terms of historic buildings, there's embodied carbon, the carbon that was used to create the building in the first place. There's not a massive amount you can do in a historic building with that, but there are things you can do when you're making changes, extensions, upgrades, etc. You can take license to this. At the moment, regulation, so the Scottish Government's technical standards, etc., are mainly around operational carbon. So how much tons of carbon are emitted per year, kind of thing, in that measurement. And usually that involves building a virtual model of the building and simulating, how it does that. Embodied carbon is something that's very much on the horizon. It's been talked about for quite a while, and it's, those in the know about it. But at the moment, there's not fully agreed kind of metrics and methodologies of how that would be measured. And the reason for that is that buildings these days are built from materials from all over the world. So it's being able to trace those kind of lines of supply. What is true, and I think it's something that Scotland can particularly lead in, is that sustainably managed timber is an excellent building material for reducing embodied carbon and to impact operational carbon as well. So you'll sometimes see, I'm sure some of the librarians will have seen it, that maybe extensions to what were maybe stone buildings end up being produced in timber structures with timber cladding. Aesthetically, that's nice if there's a kind of contrast between old and new, but it's a great sustainable thing as well. It's a true sustainable material that actually sequesters carbon in it, and in my view is also very beautiful as well.
That's fabulous. I love even the idea of the old new, the juxtaposition there, the visual statement, and then also benefits to the environment. And I must confess, I didn't realise there would be the two types. So that in itself, because I know National Library of Scotland in particular, they've been doing a lot of work in carbon reduction, but I mean, the embodied carbon, is that the historic ones? I mean, that must be something that, Heather, you're coming across when you're working with historic buildings too.
Yes, and obviously at Historic Environment Scotland, we've got a whole technical team of people that answer questions on a very regular basis, and provide guidance, technical guidance documents to explain all sorts of things about a way a building operates, and we're developing some case studies, particularly around sustainability in the historic environment, and there's a number of technical guidance documents already in existence, new ones coming through that can say, look, here's this type of building, these are the sorts of measures that can improve the energy efficiency of that building. Here are some very basic things that people can do, and because I think when we talk a lot about the technical solutions in buildings to make them more energy efficient, some people get a little bit lost in all of that, and I think the more guidance and the more supporting that we have to help people to work through some of those things, the better. So I think that connection between Historic Environment Scotland and the libraries is a really positive one, because that helps disseminate the message. But back to sustainability and housing really a little bit more widely, I think there's the technical solutions that people are talking about and are very, very exercised about those things just now. But there's also two other key factors. That there's the cost of improving your buildings around energy efficiency, and then that behavioural change that needs to happen too, that social change, and those three things have to work together. Bruce is talking there about our visits out as part of being Saltire Award judges, and we go into people's homes, and one of the questions I always ask is, what measures were put into your house to help you with energy efficiency? Do you understand how to use them? And do you feel comfortable using these various technical solutions? And quite a lot of time, people don't understand the full benefits, and actually are probably mitigating some of the things that have been put in because of the types of behaviours that they're doing. And I think one case we discovered that someone was actually just switching things off, like the the heating system, because they didn't know how to make it work properly, and it was noisy and irritating. So that as we moved forward to try and become a more sort of sustainable country, in terms of working towards net zero, we've got to come at it from a whole number of different angles, and seeing people understand and feel supported is really key. And then there's a whole other financial issue that goes along about helping people to afford these various measures. So
absolutely, it's so incredible to hear, because I think one of the things that we come across in libraries very often is just exactly what you're saying, Heather, that it's not enough to have technology available. People need to know how to use it. People need good quality information. These guides, are they available then? I will be able to include the links to the kind of various things that Historic Environment.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
That would be such a benefit.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share those with you.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Because I mean, many of our SILIPS members, they are working in older, sometimes historic buildings that I think that embodied, it's perhaps not as good as it should be, but it sounds as if there are still steps that they could take then in their everyday working practices to enact that positive change, do you think?
I think there is, and I think you've used a key word there as well, Kirsten, in steps. Not trying to do it all in one go. So obvious things is things like lighting, for instance, which is obviously very important in a library setting, but looking at low energy lighting, LED lighting, rather than older lights, maybe more focused lighting. So at reading stations, for instance, rather than trying to light a whole area as well, and reducing overall kind of lux, the power required for it as well. Even as a first step, without affecting the building, as it were, that in itself, could reduce energy significantly. And Heather's absolutely correct. With that comes human interaction about how to manage the lighting, when to switch on, perhaps automated systems, perhaps not. We had an interesting story about 5 years ago. We did a a small terrace of houses, and we did them at different kind of energy standards. So one was looking way in the future, one was kind of about 5 years ahead about now, and one was as it was. And the one that used the most energy, that had the most gadgets, was the future one. And it was because the tenant, though they were showing stuff, it obviously didn't get through, and they didn't really understand how to control the production of heat and when best to do it and all these kind of things. And I know for a fact, I've read a lot of the guidance from Historic Scotland as well, and Environment Scotland, and this, and that's a key part with all buildings, because they've got a heating cycle. You heat them up and they heat down, they cool down slowly as well. So knowing about that, about the management of the building and its systems, is for all buildings is really, really crucial. And it's also worth saying as well, a lot of the guidance, a lot of the technical guidance from HES is it's not even necessarily on energy upgrades. One of the most sustainable things we can do is just to continue using buildings, without demolishing things all the time, kind of thing, so and learn to live, within that thing as well. So often about how you look after the building fabric, how you maintain it as well, prolongs the life of a building. That's one of the most sustainable things you do. I think there's a famous statistic that goes around that in 50 years' time, 80% of the buildings that will be then are already here. We're not going to be building that many new buildings, particularly libraries probably. It is going to be old buildings. So we really do need to learn better how to look after them better and how to reduce their energy as they are, without adapting too heavily.
Definitely, that makes such a lot of sense. And I think it's one of the things even we've noticed when planning events, there's this awful temptation to do more, to buy more, and you think actually it's recycles at the end, it's reduce, reuse, recycle, and I think exactly. We've got such a wonderful fabric of buildings in this country. And I really like that's such a great tip about lighting as well. One of the case studies that we've looked at for Phillips Go Green, University Cork College Library, they have been award-winning with their sustainability, and lighting was a key part of that because it's a university campus, so it's like high use areas or the automatic. I think what's great about that is it breaks it into something manageable, something that you can do rather than somehow raise things to the ground, build the environmental ideal and hope for the best.
And sometimes, it's came about because how designers have approached it. They approach it in a very a kind of dumb kind of way, if I use that phrase. They're thinking about blanket lux levels rather than task specific things. So maybe reading points kind of thing. And because they approach it like that, it's a very blunt tool, and therefore they haven't refined it down to how it could be, kind of thing. And things like automation of these systems is something that's coming for newer buildings, but it can be retrofitted to some degree as well. So definitely, as an easy first stop to try and reduce energy consumption, that's probably the first point I call, I would say.
Great stuff. And I know that
sorry, Kirsten. I was thinking about also the types of libraries that you have. So one of the other things that happens with architects is once, and I probably need to say this quietly, but once they've done something in one place, they tend to replicate it in other places. So we have sort of archetypes of libraries. So I'm thinking about your network. If you're in a very similar building to someone somewhere else in the country, is sharing your knowledge and your expertise about how you're managing that particular type of building. So some people may be in very old buildings, some might be in the lovely 1960s and 70s designs that came through, so that there'll be different types of libraries where those different types of buildings perform in a certain way, and maybe a little knowledge sharing group between those particular types might be helpful.
That's such a great idea, because you'll know that, two of our libraries in particular, Western Isles and Inverclyde, there's you represented well, Bruce, but they are part of climate beacons for COP26, and yet you think that sort of geographically not close at all, and yet so much knowledge sharing. And you're right, ideas that if we kept our little hubs, our little boxes, we'd never get to share, and you would never get the benefit of it. I know that we touched on dare bring it up, the issue of funding as well, Heather, because this is, needless to say, this is an issue that affects many libraries. The reopening struggles, they've been well represented in the press. They are facing kind of cutbacks, further restrictions. it seems to be a kind of intuitive thing that in the long term, sustainability is of huge economic benefit, but there's a bit of reticence in the short term. Has that been your experience?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it started with funding and then moved to sustainability. And are we talking about sustainability in terms of financial there? But I think there's a I think when it comes to funding, generally it's what is it you're actually trying to achieve, and then you go out and you find the funding source that meets that particular need. And I think as our focus towards tackling climate change generally across all funders, as that ramps up, I think funding streams around that area are likely to change too, and move towards supporting people's ideas more around sustainability and tackling climate change. Yeah, so I think it's always thinking about what problem are you trying to solve and what do you need that money for, and then having your voice heard in terms of grant makers, funding providers reach out in terms of public consultations around their programmes. Historic Environment Scotland have recently reached out around our grants programme and have been asking for feedback, and many other funders do that. So I think as a membership body, responding to some of those public consultations around funding streams, and getting the voice of heard in there in terms of what your challenges are, it may be a sensible thing to do.
That sounds great, and I think definitely that identifying what you want to do with it is so important, because I mean, libraries, they know that they're it's for the current generation, but also for the future. That's the reason that we're preserving this knowledge, preserving this technology, preserving this information. So I think to really, not to hide their light under a bushel, to really make that clear when we're moving forward with this. I know that in our discussion earlier as well, it's been wonderful to realise the connections that are between the organisations, because as I mentioned, HES are our kind sponsors, exhibitors at the Autumn Regathering, and Bruce, we've already touched on Inverclyde Libraries doing some wonderful work in the area of sustainability. Are there any projects that you have in mind or you've seen on the horizon that our libraries could support, get involved with it? There's a kind of role for them to play at all?
Something came up for me recently. It's one of Inverclyde's libraries, the Southwest Library, in a fairly deprived area, and what they found is, in one of the cities this might have happened quicker, but they basically have a scrap area of land around about the library, and they're talking about creating a reading garden. And one of my hats that I wear is I run a couple of community gardens through the Inverclyde shed as well. And I met with the librarians there. I was very interested because we were intrigued with this idea that food sustainability, growing your own food. I think we're maybe starting to see some of the effects of this between the pandemic, between Brexit and a few other things as well, and about kind of availability of kind of fresh produce and affordability of fresh produce. And it was a fascinating idea, because what I said, and they asked me how I knew about these things, and I said, well, I was kind of autodidact. I learned. I went out and I read things, and I went to the library and took out the book and learned about stuff, kind of thing. So we were interested in that idea of libraries as disseminators of this knowledge that makes communities more resilient. In that case, it's a community library, but it could equally apply to schools, colleges as well. This, not that you're necessarily going to become a grower of food, but that you better understand how food is produced and the carbon impacts, everything that it has, in terms of intensive farming and all these kind of things, salmon, all these kind of things. And I think, that disseminating that kind of knowledge, allowing people to experience growing. I sometimes say to people that for me, it's the best thing I've learned is patience. It takes time. It takes time to grow things, and it's not an instant TV dinner. There's a lot of work goes into that.
But when you have it on the plate, my goodness.
What a value, exactly. You learn the value of it, kind of thing, So, I wonder, for instance, libraries will typically have some kind of garden. Most libraries I know have got kind of garden space around about them or land around about them. So there may be as opportunity there to both disseminate the knowledge, collate the knowledge, but also demonstrate the knowledge applied as well in a safe space for communities, whether that's schools or whatever kind of thing. And I appreciate it's one aspect, it's growing, and it's a little bit tangential maybe to the buildings, but I increasingly think it's going to be one of the key parts. You know, there's a reason why we've got so many food banks. It's right at the heart of poverty, you might say, which is housing as well. You know, so one of the big expenses is food. You know, if you can reduce that, you allow more housing to happen as well. So that I think libraries going forward have got a real role there, and by doing that, I think they become, it's a bit like churches a little bit. They come back to the centre of community, kind of thing, because it's a kind of agnostic topic, food, you know, and it means that land that's currently in control of, for instance, a local authority or a university, for instance, gets brought into community use as well, without necessarily having to transfer legal things and stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's a current project example. We were working with a library. But I think, yeah, that idea of, you know, there's a great role here, apart from improving the buildings, is libraries disseminating the information, the HES information, for instance, to others to improve their buildings. You know, so as a disseminator role, the traditional role of a library, as it were.
Yeah, to go back to the church, it's like teach a man to fish, isn't it?
Back to basics a little bit, kind of thing. But that reconnection and empowerment of community that they're in, whatever that community be, I think there is a little bit of refinding that, you know, and yeah, like I say, sometimes it can seem quite prosaic, but it's really important. You know, I've personally become a big advocate. I personally think nursery kids and school kids should be getting horticultural lessons, frankly, so that they understand, you know, when you buy a cucumber or an onion, you understand that that's taken 6 months to grow, kind of thing, you know, in some cases. So, and that it's got value, you know, to it, kind of thing.
Definitely. And
I was just following that thought through from Bruce, is about libraries' role in communities, and as we move more and more to this concept around sort of placemaking and the new drive to look at 20-minute neighbourhoods with all of your services locally and accessibly, is the library's voice in that development of what does your place look like, what's important for your place, and how communities are engaging with their libraries to develop their thinking, and what better place to sit and meet together than a library to talk about your place, to have access to that information, to that research, to that knowledge, to help shape your thinking. So, you know, opening up to look at placemaking and drawing on your resources to do that, I think is an interesting development. And I think there's also greater community involvement in libraries. I think as some libraries across, it's not just Scotland, but across the UK have found it more and more challenging to operate in their more traditional models and roles. The community coming forward and saying, actually, we can help you here, and you know, whether that be through volunteering or in some cases a sort of community ownership of their library. All of these things help the place. You know, it doesn't matter so much in terms of who's looking after it, it's the importance of having that resource in your community.
Absolutely. And I think it's because we're often told that libraries are the heart of their community, and that comes across so well. And of course, all different, there's relatively few spaces, I think, or public spaces, free spaces, where all generations will come together, all different groups within a community, almost without realizing it. So, and it's so, I don't know if you've read recently the Carnegie report on SpaceForKindness, because this was many of our libraries were involved in kindness initiatives, but it's interesting, many of them did create kindness gardens or growing gardens, and this interplay between, I think, community cohesion, community connections, and literal growing and other things, it's really beautiful to see. And it sounds as if it would set the foundations for actually more positive ways of interacting with each other as much as with the planet. That's
right. Yeah, and you create network. You know, for instance, recently we got a little bit of funding, and I think we did 14 schools in Inverclyde, set up small growing spaces. And you know, we're not a library, but what we do is we keep in contact and we provide information and links and things so that they, we don't want to look after it for them. We want them to look after it and learn how to do it and do their own thing as well. But that model is the library. That's how the libraries were formed, basically. So yeah, there's still a huge power, I think, in what the library does. It doesn't need, I don't think it needs complete reinvention. It just needs refinding, perhaps, the kind of the way back into community.
It's lovely to have a positive angle with sustainability in these, because I know that people talk about eco-anxiety, or it can get a bit apocalyptical, which, I mean, there's good reasons for that, but it's really, I mean, because I've noted down empowerment as well. It's like remembering the power that we do have just in numbers and coming together. One of the other interviews we've done for Phillips Go Green was with Glasgow Seed Library. And again, they were, one of the things about growing, I think it was creating that safe space, because people were quite reticent. I mean, I know you haven't necessarily grown something since you were your little pots of cress in primary school, and you don't want to, it's about that space to try, to experiment and to learn, as you're saying.
In the social aspect, none of this is of any point unless there's a good, strong community there. There's no, and yet the eco-anxiety thing's a very real thing. Again, the technical aspect I do is I'm often assessing new houses in terms of their energy performance, but no single building or no group of buildings is going to save this. This is big. It's really big. No country is going to save this kind of thing, and we need to realize that, well, for instance, new houses, not only are they becoming more efficient, or new buildings become more efficient, but the national grid's becoming increasingly decarbonized as well. So even if we are using energy, it's wind turbines, and in the future it'll probably be wave. It'll be coming into it as well. So, and you can imagine, if you imagine the changing metrics, so where a house these days is built on a certain metric, so there's a certain amount of coal-fired power being produced in the national grid. 20 years time, there might be it might be completely carbon neutral. So it doesn't matter how much energy you use in a building, it's going to be carbon neutral. Old buildings, new buildings, doesn't matter. So, but you're right, absolutely right. It's a very real thing. I'm actually quite worried about it, kind of thing, that it's part of the messaging. Everyone's been told that they need to act, they need to do things, and it's not quite as simple as that. It is important. You should do things, try and recycle as much as you can, do these things. But I think you touched upon it, Kirsten, is just being a little bit thrifty at the beginning is the best start. Just kind of don't be wasteful. As simple as that.
Borrow your books, don't buy them.
yeah, exactly. Sharing as a concept is thriftiness, basically. It's about sharing resource. So it's, again, the libraries have embodied this very basic sustainable concept. A principle: share, don't duplicate. Spread in not just knowledge, but share the resources in terms of the books and the space as well. So, you could say libraries at their heart have got a very, very sustainable principle at their heart, and that should be celebrated without being complacent about it. But I wouldn't want your members to be become anxious about how can we save X amount of energy on my one building kind of thing. Do as well as you can within reason, within funding limits, etc. None of us are going to do this ourselves. There is no one solution to this. It's going to take an awful lot of people across the globe, and it's likely we're going to get impact whatever we do, kind of thing. So, but I think we just do best we can, and I think what Heather's saying there as well is that this is wider than just the technical carbon energy. That's the cause of some of the issues that will impact social. But at the same time, we shouldn't lose ourselves in this. We should come out stronger as community, and I mean that in the widest kind of sense. The danger is it starts to become a kind of league table of who's the most sustainable. Yeah, it's irrelevant. It's a no-winner situation kind of thing.
I think taking that to its sort of wider place, as we were saying, it's thinking about, well, what are the resources of Scotland? What have we got there at our disposal? How are we using those resources? How are we replenishing those resources? And how are we keeping as local as we possibly can? And sometimes we need to go backwards to find out what all of these things were, to re-find them, to re-educate ourselves, and libraries are a great resource for that too. Is to what was here back then? What were those sort of traditional skills? What were those? If we're going back to our food analogy, what were those recipes that we did back then? And so that we can take some of those things that we've forgotten and reintroduce them. In terms of some of the things that we can do to use our local resources better. I think, if we just look at our day-to-day practice and think about actually where has that come from, more than just food, where has that come from? What am I using? Where did that come from? And how long is it going to last for? And just, it's not an anxiety thing. It's just thinking. It's stopping and thinking and going, have I made the right choice here in terms of what I've bought, what I'm using, how I'm using it.
The scary thing is that the more we look back, the better it is. Better recipes, it's better food.
I don't know about the better recipes, it depends which era you go to. True. I'm afraid any recipe I tackle, it will always be disgusting 200 years ago or today, I'm afraid. But I mean, it's such a good point, because again, the National Library, they have their map collection is online, and what they will do with different viewers is through georeferencing, they'll put the old map and the new map together so you can see the change. And you're right, actually, I think it was all there, no doubt in the future. We don't want to look back and think what we've lost. We want to see what we held on to and what we realized was precious. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I feel uplifted. I feel encouraged, which is lovely. It's sometimes a bit rare in climate discussions and sustainability discussions to feel like there's hope or there's potential, but I think we've touched on these kind of steps. And yes, I think our members, whatever kind of library they're in, whatever kind of work they're doing, there's hope for them to together make a difference in that knowledge sharing and in that mindful inhabiting of spaces, really. So just thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, Bruce and Heather. It's really been an honour to benefit from your expertise, your ideas, and I know that all our SILIPS members are going to really, really appreciate it. And we will have more exciting SILIPS Go Green content coming soon. But for now, on behalf of all of the SILIPS community, let me just say thank you very, very much to you both.
You're more than welcome, Kirsten. Thank you for the opportunity.